All right, well, as mentioned, my name is Ryan Andal. I'm the president of Secret Location. When we started the company 10 years ago, I was the technical director. I'm a bit of an introvert, definitely more comfortable behind a computer than speaking really in any form. Just the sheer amount of Photoshop work to get me to approach a smile there, it's really amazing. I unfortunately haven't really touched line of code in 2 years, so I basically have lost all of the skill set of a developer, but kept all the personality deficiencies. So there's going to be none of these things, unfortunately, in the presentation. Some quick background on my company. Secret Location, we've won over and been nominated for over 250 awards in the last decade or so. We won the first Emmy in VR, the first Peabody, as well as a bunch of other awards. We were acquired by a larger entertainment group called Entertainment One, or E1. They're sort of more on the traditional side of distributing film, TV, and music. Secret Location itself is about 120 people who work exclusively in the VR industry, with our efforts split between content and distribution, primarily with these two brands, Secret Location being focused on our content efforts, and Vuser being focused on our distribution efforts. I spend a lot of time at Secret Location sort of working on what we call the fragmentation problem in VR. To explain that quickly, at the advent of every new piece of general purpose technology, there's a stage of fragmentation and eventually consolidation. Just to reference sort of a more mature market, really this is what it looks like. New technology is created. Market interest sort of grows in that technology, so many companies end up entering the space. Many of them get bought out by their competitors, and a lot of them die. And then we eventually end up with a consolidated marketplace dominated by just a handful of players. And usually this is the precipice to what would be sort of market disruption. But as opposed to getting into augmented reality, which is a wholly different market itself, I'll sort of get back to virtual reality. What's important to remember is that virtual reality is still very much a nascent market. And let me put that nascency into context. So remember the hype around 3D printing quite a while ago? Another general purpose technology. Everyone thought it would revolutionize sort of the manufacturing industry, and it was incredibly exciting. And you bought your 3D printer, your first 3D printer, and you began to print something, and you realized that it just sucked. That was the first thing that I ever printed. But the thing is, if we gave up on it then, we wouldn't have biotech companies all over the globe printing things like human tissue with the eventual goal of creating living organs. We also wouldn't have companies, architectural companies, sort of 3D printing housing. And none of this is, perfect, mind you, but it's kind of a step in the right direction, which is where we're trying to go with VR. Now, when I view virtual reality as an entertainment medium, I look at the holistic business of Entertainment One and the legacy of mediums like film, music, and gaming. And we take a lot of cues and learnings from the history to try and figure out a better way forward. So when I think about the history, really, you look at the nascent film area. In the 1900s, independent movie theaters began cropping up. Theaters like the Nickelodeon. Something wrong there with the remote. No. Oh, there it is. So theaters like the Nickelodeon rapidly expanded as consumer appetite grew. And as they grew, sort of the industry started to face its first distribution challenge, which is all of these theaters needed to get, in order to get people back to their doors, they needed to get a steady flow of films coming in. So enter the, this is, yeah. There it is. Do you want me to use the new remote? Okay. So in 1904, Warner Brothers created the Duquesne Amusement and Supply Company. This was the first major, what they called a film exchange to solve this problem. allowing theaters to retrieve sort of a steady pipeline of content. If we can go to the next slide. The practice of having a distributor focus on large-scale supply really still exists today with companies like our parent company, Entertainment One. However, the last few decades have seen a lot of shift in consumer viewing behavior. Next slide. If you hand me the remote, I can do it from here. Oh yeah, that's good. So we went from kind of this out-of-home viewing pattern to really with film to really a migration to at the home, largely with individual consumption. Consumption with DVDs, TVOD, AVOD, and now SVOD, which is dominated by people like Netflix, Hulu, and Amazon. The gaming industry really went through the same sort of supply scale and change. What's it called? We started with arcades. That eventually migrated over to individual consumption at the home with the development of consoles. Then began sort of the growth of brick and mortar distribution entities like GameStop, which has now really been destroyed by platforms like Steam and PlayStation, Xbox networks. Now with VR, we're kind of repeating the same patterns, the same mistakes, and the problem really has never been solved in terms of trying to communicate transparency within the value chain. So let's just really quickly take a look at the value chain because I think it outlines what the real problem is here for content creators. And the value chain looks like this. It starts with ideation, then funding, then production, then distribution, and finally consumption by the audience. And I'll walk through each of these really quickly. So you start with an idea, and maybe that idea, is wholly yours and it's original. Maybe you've negotiated the rights for some piece of content or source material. And after you've successfully captured those rights, you go out and you find funding. That can come in the form of investor dollars, or maybe you get funding from a publisher or a studio. And if you do that, then usually they look for some form of distribution control as a result. So it's just another form of right that you have to capture. And then you get into production, and maybe you can do the production entirely yourself, or maybe you need to go to an external production company in order to help you out as you try and scale up. Maybe you get some form of high-value talent on board, and they want a piece of a royalty instead of paying them millions of dollars up front. And maybe you use production tools like Unity or Unreal, which also take a percentage of the overall pie. And then finally, once you've built something, you need to distribute it. And there are a lot of at-home consumption distribution tools, like I mentioned, Steam, or if you make a video, you can put it up on YouTube. But typically, what will happen in a mature market is you go to a distributor, and that distributor will essentially break it down by striking out all the different territories, different countries, all of the different markets like SVOD, AVOD, TVOD, and try and sell it in all of these different verticals, trying to slice it as much as they can so that they can really maximize the value of that piece of content. And that, in and of itself, is a form of right that has to carry across the distribution channel. And then finally goes to consumption, where the audience actually views it. And any revenue that's garnered from that audience that's viewing it has to funnel back to each of these players in the chain previous. And what's happening right now with the traditional film industry and the gaming industry is essentially when it funnels back, all of the auditing to make sure that the dollars are correct, that go back to the talent, that go back to the production company, that go back to the eventual IP owner, all of that has to be audited individually. And it's a very wasteful system right now because there's a lot of contracting that's involved in between, and like I said, there's a lot of counting that's involved in between. In a world where the kind of content can be different and the method of consumption can change, this value chain is pretty consistent across film, television, gaming, music, and virtual reality. But the birth of this new medium is really, I view, an opportunity for us to sort of step in the right direction, not repeat some of those old mistakes, and look at the out-of-home entertainment market more seriously and how we translate that value chain across the board as opposed to looking just at-home digital platforms. Now, before I get into the solution specifically, I'd like to talk about the current state of VR because we're at a really interesting inflection point in the industry. It's a very fragmented industry. And that fragmentation really outlines what the different market segments are, and I'll talk you through that. So when you look at the VR market today, it's really bisected into these four categories: at-home entry level, at-home premium, out-of-home entry level, out-of-home premium. If you're not familiar with these categories, essentially everything on the at-home entry level is the sub $200 price point. Different kinds of content that you'll see there, and I'll walk you through that. At-home premium is sort of the room scale model that we're seeing with Oculus, Vive, PlayStation. On the out-of-home entry level, that's where you're starting to see a lot of seated VR experiences or VR arcades. And then on the out-of-home premium side, that's where we start to see hyper arcades. And like I said, each of these markets has slightly different content. And as a result, being able to protect that content is slightly different. So as I mentioned, 360 video really dominates the at-home entry-level market, whereas gaming dominates the at-home premium market, which is no surprise to anybody. And then on this side, we see a mixture of motion track 360 video, single-player, multiplayer games. And hyper arcades are largely meant to be narrative and gaming for multiple people going through it at one time. And as we start to look at the different pricing structures here, what we tend to see are different business models as a result. So because there's this expectation on the at-home entry level for content to be free, the business model has to be very different. And then even as we go over to the out-of-home sector, the per ticket model versus the per hour model, obviously very different business sectors and different things that you have to handle from a rights perspective. And this is really how creators are making money in the space. It's a mixture on this side of sponsorship, AVOD, transactional purchase, and then on the gaming side, we're starting to see new things like in-game ads, in-game purchases. And then on the out-of-home side, as I mentioned, per minute, per month, or percentage of ticket are really the primary models that are winning out today. Depending on penchant for risk for the operator, they're willing to do any number of these models, and I've seen different players out there sort of dominate in different categories. And then on the hyper arcade side, what's happening is a lot of these hyper arcades are purchasing hardware systems that are turnkey solutions. So it's essentially a piece of content dovetailed with hardware, and that's packaged as one holistic offering. And then on the distribution platform side, like I said, we're seeing the same major players on the at-home side, whereas really there isn't that major player that exists on the out-of-home entertainment side. The closest I would say is probably a Springboard VR, where they have something like 300 arcades that we deal with, but that's still a small market by and large. And when you look at companies like Valve, who created Counter-Strike, what's interesting is they created Steam to solve an internal problem. So every time they would have a patch to fix something in the game, they would essentially, they would essentially take down their servers for several days. And building Steam was meant to solve that problem. But what it really solved for the industry was having wide level distribution without having to go through brick and mortar. This overall paradigm shift destroyed companies like GameStop, as I mentioned, and the retail model around a digital commodity. Similar pattern really happened with Netflix and Blockbuster. So they fundamentally solved the distribution problem for out-of-home. But again, it still exists for at-home, but it still exists for the out-of-home market, for the location-based entertainment market. And really that's the fundamental area where VR is starting today, where we're starting to see a lot of traction. So as we start to grow this marketplace, we want to think about how we can service all sectors. And this is, I just wanted to say that the problem with the out-of-home sector is that they are sort of a monolithic and archaic industry, and they don't adapt to technology well. Going to IAP and seeing this actually really outlined that for me, that they don't adapt technology very well. It's kind of a mix of this archaic style of buying amusement and newer technology, as opposed to trying to think holistically how that would work within an ecosystem. So looking at the value chain again, I'll walk through our own experience and tell you about what we're doing differently. So we spent some time and some of our own dollars creating blasters of the universe. Began looking at things like, what's it called? We needed to lock financing for it. And essentially we built a prototype. Then we began licensing that title to locations, which literally means calling up each of the locations, talking to them about your game, sending them your keys, getting them to play it, and negotiating a price, structuring a licensing agreement, having to construe to all those terms. And I mean, Blasters itself is licensed in over 70 arcades, 9 different countries, but being able to track all of that information is a bit of a nightmare, quite frankly. And we worked with a third-party company in order to be able to port it to PlayStation. As a result, they earned a specific amount of revenue for any titles sold on PlayStation, so that's another form of right that we need to be able to track. Now, while we initially did all of this work manually, the goal of what we wanted to do was eventually move away from having to do this manually. And the idea for how to solve that problem came about in an interesting way. We do a hack week basically every quarter at our company. We have a different theme. And essentially, we wanted to, we kept the theme open for VR, and we wanted to try and solve different problems. We break out into different teams and try and solve what the problems are in VR. And the team that I was a part of really thought of this idea of how we try and transcend across the entire value chain using blockchain and Ethereum smart contracts in order to really accomplish this. And in case these are foreign terms to you, blockchain is essentially just a public ledger where basic transactions are validated by third-party miners. And smart contracts allow us to create complex transactions to programmatically apply sort of different business rules and legal agreements to what would be more or less basic transactions. So in just 5 days, we showcased our product to the company, and it spectacularly failed. Unfortunately, and I'm not really good at bullshitting my way out of a failed demo, so we ended up losing that hack week, unfortunately. But I'll show, what, I unfortunately don't think we have time to show the video around the winning product.
And Spotify exclusively plays board jams. People begin to crave something simpler.
Yeah, sorry, we're running out of time here, so I'll skip over what the winning product is. But the point is, we never really gave up on this idea, even though we lost that hack week, and we wanted to figure out how we can translate it over to the marketplace and solve the problem of manual distribution, which is what we were doing. So we built a product that we now call Vuser Spark, and this happened a while ago. We're going to be releasing it this summer with key content partners. And it's essentially just an SDK that wraps around a game or a content experience, and it handles sort of all of the different rights flows that would happen across that value chain, all the way from ideation to consumption. And initially, it's meant to manage the financial rights, manage playback rights, track all of the usage, and then protect the playback so that as it translates over across that value chain, we're keeping track of who owns all of those rights every time it's played, and we can automatically distribute revenue as a result to all of the different partners. But the thing is, what's interesting, anyway, about being able to do this with Spark and putting it on blockchain is the idea is that we want to democratize. We want to democratize the system in a way that, let's say a Netflix isn't, but a Steam is very democratized for distribution because it's an open platform, a submission platform where people can contribute to it. And as you start to think about solving just the rights management problem, it means that you can start to do different things within those different verticals in the value chain. You can build, for example, an auction house. If a right happens to run out, let's say it's a windowed term for a piece of content, runs out after a year, someone else can bid on the next year's right. This kind of product actually exists in smaller markets for video distribution. So if you're not dealing with a company in a large market, they have a means for broadcasters to be able to bid on programmatically different pieces of content that would exist, and E1 actually uses platforms like this. The other idea that we came up with is essentially crowdfunding. You could distribute who owns pieces of your content, and that could be infinite to any number of people, which is why it kind of opens itself up to crowdfunding. And eventually, what will happen, and this has happened to us, quite frankly, whenever we license a title from somebody and then license it back to an arcade, there's essentially 5% of loss that happens in that transaction. 2.5% pulling it away and then pushing it back out to another entity when we make the dollars in between. That 5% loss is actually pretty significant, which is why cryptocurrency is sort of the perfect mechanism for something like this that can transact internationally without incurring that 5% of loss in the transaction in different countries. And one quick final thought. I know I'm running over time, so I'll just leave you with this final thought. I had a conversation with Charlie Fink, and he's sort of a brilliant tech writer for Forbes, all-around great guy. He recently mentioned us in one of his articles. Thank you, by the way, Charlie. After my last talk at VRLA, he came up and he asked me, where's all this going? Are you competing with Springboard or what? And I answered, kinda. Which is kind of the stupidest fucking answer that I could have given him. Again, I'm a developer, so I'm not really great off the cuff. But honestly, if you ever book time with me to have a meeting, here are my contact details, by the way, and you want to talk through sort of our entire business plan, just put me in front of a whiteboard and I'll do it, because quite frankly, I'm fairly transparent and open, which is kind of the mentality with blockchain overall. I'm fairly transparent and open about what we're doing within the industry, the problem that we're trying to solve across that value chain. And the thing is, I'm not inherently a creative guy, but if I've learned anything over the last decade of creating content, it's that great content can be a very powerful thing. And if we can build tools to decrease the barriers connecting creators to audiences, then we can enable the next generation of creators to have that power. And in an upcoming era of automation and joblessness, in an era where way too much power is concentrated in too few entities, blockchain really has the power to democratize the friction across this value chain, to enable the younger generation of creators in a way that, Kickstarter, Indiegogo, and Patreon did on the funding side, or Flash, rest in peace, and Unity really did on the production side, or Steam and iOS and YouTube really did on the distribution side. The goal is to create or to minimize friction going from creators to audiences and trying to make that easier for the next generation of creators. Thank you.